All right. So we're going to, I told you I'm going to try to finish Hosea, today, but I might not be able to. But I'm just going to hit the highlights. What I want you to know, I told Ann to remind me this. Give me a pen here so I can write down what I want you to know. Okay. You got that?
Yep, got it word by word.
And okay. Whew. Just in case I forget. One thing God all through the Bible is trying to say that He is sovereign. He owns everything. He owns the stars. He owns the heavens. He owns earth. He owns all of the cattle. He said that they get cattle on 1,000 hills. But He owns everything. And He owns you because He gave you life. You can say, oh, my mother and father did that. But ultimately, He was the one who allowed you to come into existence. And now, here, I want to just, 2 verses I want to tell you about, and so I can make it brief. The one is in Deuteronomy. In Deuteronomy, from chapters 28 on to 31, it tells the conditions of the people that are in that land, and what they need to do in order to stay in that land. And it is to love the Lord, to serve the Lord, and to do what He says. Now, over in Deuteronomy chapter 30, we're studying in the book of Hosea. And in Deuteronomy chapter 30 and verse 20, this is what he says. He says, you are to love God, to obey His voice, and cleave unto Him. And he says, this is Moses talking to the people because God gave him instructions. For He is your life, and He is the length of your days, that you may dwell in the land which the Lord sware unto your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now, when God promised the land to Abraham, it was unconditional. God said, I'm going to give you this, and then He reiterated that to Isaac. He reiterated that to Jacob. But when he got to the mountain where He gave down the law and the proceedings of how they were to move on, He said, this is conditional. He says, if you want to stay in the land that's flowing with milk and honey, and you want my blessings, because in chapter 28 and 29 of Deuteronomy, He says, I will bless you if you do this, and I'll bless you if you do that, and I'll bless you if you do that. But if you do this wrong, you do that wrong, and you do this wrong, and you disobey me and worship other gods, I will destroy you. He said, because your whole purpose is to let the whole world know that I am God. I'm a loving God. I'm a gracious God. And so what He wanted them to know, that He was sovereign above anything and everybody. Then He said He is a holy God. Holy means that He has been set apart from everything else because of His holiness. But then, beside His sovereignty and His holiness, He is righteous. And if He is righteous, He has to judge righteously. So if He says over here, you do this and I'll bless you, but if you do this, all these curses are going to come upon you. And so God is in a dilemma here, and we're going to see how He has feelings. That's what the Bible says, grieve not the Holy Spirit which is in you. It means sometimes if you do wrong things, and you shouldn't, the Spirit in you is grieving. And He's going to discipline you or jerk you back into fellowship. But the other one is that he is a loving God. He's gracious, full of mercy, and he doesn't want to hurt you. So when we go through here, the first 2 chapters were terrible because he's telling Hosea, go, I want you to marry a whore who is a prostitute, and you're going to have kids by that prostitute, and one of them is going to be Jezreel, and one is going to be Lo Ruhama, and the other is going to be Lo Ami, which means that you're not going to have any mercy, and you're not my kids, you've gone astray. But then later on he says, I want you to go and say to, instead of Lo Ruhama, he changes, drops the Lo off, because Lo means not. And he says, Ruhama means I will show mercy. You will be my daughter. And he says, to your son, Ami, Lo Ami means not mine, but Ami means you are my son. And he said, I'm going to call Israel later on to be my children. And then he says something strange here in chapter 2. And I know we covered this last week. But chapter 2, he says in verse 16, he says, and it shall be at that day, saith the Lord, that you shall call me Ishai. Now, Ishai is a very tender word. It means my husband. Because God said when he brought them out of Egypt, he was betrothed to them because he nurtured them, provided for them, helped them to grow, and he loved them. And so he was like a father. And he said, you'll no longer call me Baali. Baali was, Baal was the false god, and it was an endearing name like, oh, he is my Lord, And he said, you won't call me Lord anymore or Master anymore, but you'll say, he's my husband. He says, so it's not somebody that's going to discipline you, it's somebody that's going to love you and care for you. So, but he said that's going to be later down the road. And then look here in verse 19. And he says, and I will betroth you unto me forever. Yea, I will betroth thee unto me in righteousness, and in judgment, and in loving kindness, and in mercies. I will even betroth thee unto me in faithfulness, and thou shalt know the Lord. He says, and it shall come to pass in that day, I will hear, saith the Lord. Now this is the important thing. Now, he's already told them he's going to punish them. He's going to discipline them. They're going to go into captivity. He said, but there's coming a day when you're going to come back. Maybe not these people, but some of them will, because they've gone to other places. He says, I will hear the heavens, and they will hear the earth, and the earth shall hear the corn and the wine. What he's saying is that when you do come back eventually, that I am going to let the rains come down and fill your crops and let your grape arbors grow and the fields are going to flourish. Your sheep are not going to have stillbirth. They're going to be multiplied. And he says it's going to be a blessing. He said that's in the latter days. And that's what Paul is saying in chapter 11 of Romans. He said, look, he's talking to the Gentiles. He said, you Gentiles don't think that the Lord has cast away his people forever. He said, no, read chapter 11 of Romans. He says that they have been set aside until the fullness of the Gentiles come in. And what he's saying, he said, they rejected me, but it's only going to be for a minute because later on I'm going to give them a new heart, a new mind, a new love. And that'll be after the rapture of the church. Because he said there'll be 144,000 Jewish evangelists. And that hasn't happened yet. And so what he's saying here, and then he says this. And the earth, in verse 22, and the earth shall hear the corn and the wine and the oil, and they shall hear Jezreel. Now, Jezreel, we talked about that. There was a big slaughter over in Jezreel, and that's where Achan had messed up when they went over to fight or capture Ai, and Achan stole some of the gold that was supposed to be, and that's whenever they fought Jericho. He took the gold from Jericho, and when they went to Ai, they were defeated, and God said to Joshua, "There's sin in the camp." And that's where he called all the tribes before him, and here Achan and all of his family and all of his relatives, all of his cattle, everything he had was brought there, and found that he was the one, and God said, "Stone him." And they stoned him until they all died, and because he is, sovereign. He says, "I want obedience rather than sacrifice." And then, when they went to another place, God said, "All of the treasure is yours now." If he would have only waited. So anyway, here he says, "I will make you flourish," and he says, "and I will sow her," meaning Israel, "unto me in the earth." And the land of Israel right now, everybody wants that land, everybody. And it says the Jews have no right to it, but that is the only piece of property in the world that God had promised to anybody. And that was to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and his descendants. And he says, "And I will sow her into the land in the earth, and I will have mercy upon her that had not obtained mercy. And I will say to them that were not my people, you are my people. And they shall say, you are my God." Now, here, this is a prophecy in chapter 3. Look at verse 3. "And I said unto her," talking about Israel, "Thou shalt abide," and this is also same for Hosea, as though he's talking to his wife. He says, "And I said unto her, You shall abide for me many days. Thou shalt not play the harlot, and thou shalt not be for another man. So will I also be for you." And then he says, here, for the children, now he goes back to the children of Israel, the northern kingdom. He says this, "For the children of Israel shall abide many days without a king." Hoshea was the last king there in the northern kingdom. And he said many days. And the northern kingdom went into captivity in 722 BC. And he said many days without a king, and without a prince, and without a sacrifice, and without an image, and without an ephod. Now, ephod is the garment that the high priest used to wear. So he's saying, you're not going to have any priests, you're not going to have any sacrifices. And then he says, you're going to be without a teraphim. A teraphim is an altar or a place to make your sacrifices. And from 70 AD, when they finally went into disbursement from the Roman Empire, that they haven't had a temple because the temple was destroyed. And that's why the Jewish people now are so anxious to have their temple rebuilt. That's why that mount is so fought over, where the Muslims can go up, and that's where they have the Dome of the Rock up there. And the Muslims can go, but the Jews weren't supposed to. But little by little by little, they're getting permission to go up there. And this last year, they wanted to do a sacrifice of a heifer up there, but at the last minute they canceled it. The sacrifice of the heifer was to sanctify the land, to sprinkle it with the blood all around. So, but it's coming. They've already got all of the furniture for the new temple, and all they have to do is have the approval. Now here, in our day, here is Donald Trump is starting this peace deal. There have been little peace deals here and there and all around, but he's got this peace deal with so many of those Arab countries now that people thought impossible. And Trump's going to call it the deal of the century. And little by little, these Arab nations are saying, it's better to have peace and we can prosper. And, but it's all going to be this universal government they're working on. They're going to have universal religion. And that is why this election is extremely important, because they want to make this sort of a communist country where we're going to have everything. You know, they got the World Bank right now, and they have the United Nations right now, and they have the world government right now, and the monetary market, and they're all housed here in the United States. And Trump is getting us out of some of these deals, you know, and so we have to remember that we have to pray before we vote, you know, but the vote that you vote is extremely important. I'm not going to tell you who to vote for, but God says the people of the land back in here suffer for lack of knowledge. Look here in chapter 3, in verse 6. He says, my people are destroyed for lack of knowledge, because they have rejected knowledge. I will also reject them, that they shall be no priest to me, seeing they have forgotten the law of God. I also will forget your children. And he says, as they increased, so they sinned against me. Therefore I will change their glory into shame. He says, the more kids that they had, the worse they became, you know, and they went to these altars, and the more they prospered, the more altars to Baal and he said, I am a jealous God. He says, and when you go to worship another God, it's like being unfaithful to your husband, to God it was. Just like you would be crushed if your wife went out and she started having relations with another man and said, that guy's no good over there, I don't like him anymore, you know. It would just, if you had a love in your heart for her, and that's what God is saying, you know, he's got this heart that's mixed. He's a holy God, he's a righteous God, he's got to have judgment. He demands justice. But his love and his mercy and his grace is over here. And he says, I'll die for her. And so that's why Jesus came and died on the cross. Is that the penalty for sin had to be paid. And he said it was paid once and for all. But the Jewish people, when they were making their sacrifices, they were worshiping Baal as well as God. You know, and it's like, well, I'm going to keep 1 foot here, 1 foot here, and I'll be covered. And he said, no, you won't. Because it's not me and this, it's me or that. And so, but we have to realize how heinous sin is in God's sight. You know, and for us to try to imagine, he says, hell hath enlarged itself because of the disobedience of the people. And he knows the anguish of hell. But he says, I am a just God. I gotta send them there. So he doesn't send anybody there. It's a choice they make. He said the sacrifice was made. All they have to do is say, yes, I want it, and accept it. He said, but if you say, yes, I want it and I accept it, but then I'm going to go over here and work myself and build up my little mansions here, and then if I need help in the future. And he said, no. He said, you don't do it that way. He said, you put your trust in me, not in riches. And so that's what these people here are doing. Let me see. In verse 12, he says, of chapter 4. My people ask counsel as their stock, and their staff declareth unto them. He said, these people who used to worship me are now making this golden calf, and they're going over worshiping that, and they'll ask the golden calf, what shall I do? You know, and they're thinking that the golden calf is blessing them with their good crops and with their fertilization with their children. And he says, they don't realize it's me. So he said, I'm going to take it away from them. Then look at verse 15. Though thou, Israel, play the harlot, let not Judah offend. He said, the northern kingdom, you're wicked. But Judah, don't you come up here where they had these golden cows and start making sacrifices, or you're going to be next. But Isaiah is down in here also preaching to them, saying, you know, your time is coming, your time is coming, your time is coming. But what's hard to believe is that Hosea was prophesying to the northern kingdom for over 70 years. And they just, oh, you get out of here, I'm tired of hearing all of that stuff. And now, later on, they're going to go into captivity. And here, look at verse 13 of, I jumped over a couple because I'm going to have to hurry up. Okay, look in chapter 6. And this is something he says is going to happen in the last days. A remnant is going to come back after the captivity. And that's after the captivity of the northern kingdom going into Assyria. And the southern kingdom later on in 586 into Babylon. And you've got that chart there. Now, the Assyrian kingdom was one of the most wickedest kingdoms that ever were in this world. If you ever look it up, I mean, when the Assyrians would go in and they would conquer a land, a city, or a different nation, they would take all of the people and cut off their heads. And they would put the heads in a pile right in front of the gates that go into the city. And so anybody, and you can imagine a pile of skulls out there, a huge pile of all the people. And not only that, they were so brutal that they would take, you know, you fillet a fish, they would fillet the skin off of these people and plaster it on the walls of the wall that surrounded. So they were wicked. And so just to mention the Assyrians, you're going to go to the Assyrians. These people wanted to go down to Egypt and help down there. And so God says later on, he says, your salvation is not in Egypt. Your salvation is not over here in Assyria. Your salvation is me. And so the northern kingdom kept on backsliding. And then look here in verse 6. He says, for I desired mercy. This is 6 of chapter 6. I desired mercy and not sacrifice, and the knowledge of God more than burnt offerings. He said, if you would only stop and get to know me, to know who I am, know how much I love you, how much I care for you, how much I want you to prosper. And he said, no, I don't want to do that. I want it myself. And he says, for they like men have transgressed the covenant. Now remember back in Deuteronomy 28, he said these are the blessings. If you do righteous, these are the curses. And even when they had to go into the promised land, 6 of the tribes would be on this mountain, and 6 of the tribes would be on this mountain over here. And they would shout out the blessings over there, and these people would shout out their curses. So it was an object lesson when they went there to know that if I do righteous, I'm going to be blessed. If I do wicked, I'm going to be cursed. And God is struggling here with what he's going to do. It says, look here in chapter 7 and verse 8. He says, Ephraim has mixed himself among the people. Ephraim is a cake not turned. He's talking about bakery stuff here. And he's saying Ephraim is turned rotten. You know, he says, if you have an oven, you know, or a stove, and you're cooking a pancake or something like that, and then you just let it cook and let it cook and let it cook and let it cook, it's going to be burnt to a crisp on the bottom, but the top of it is still gooey. And he says, you're worthless. You've mingled yourself with these other people. You've had these children. You've gone astray. You're worshiping false gods. He said, you are a cake unturned, and you're good for nothing anymore. You can't witness to me anymore. So he says here, and then in verse 11 of that same chapter, he says, Ephraim also is like a silly dove without heart. They call to Egypt, and they go to Assyria. Said, Egypt is not going to help you. And then he says, when they go, I will spread my net upon them, and I will bring down as fowls from heaven. Then he says here in verse 13, woe unto them, for they have fled from me, destruction upon them, because they have transgressed against me. Though I have redeemed them, yet they have spoken lies against me, and they have not cried unto me with their heart. When they howled upon their beds, they assemble themselves for corn and wine, and they rebel against me. Though I have bound and strengthened their arms, yet do they imagine mischief against me. There's a certain time of the year, it's called Ramadan, where the Muslims believe that if they afflict themselves, that they would be accepted by Muhammad, And so they have these little wheels like razors, and they would get there and they would whip themselves. It'd be on the long string, and it'd probably 5 or 6 in the long string. They have these little sharp things, and they would whip themselves like this until their backs were a bloody pulp, because they didn't have any assurance of any kind of salvation. But if they beat themselves enough, and that's what he's saying here. You can howl all you want on your bed. You can beat your body. And remember, this was also during the time when the prophet, I'm getting one of my senior moments here, with Ahab and his wife Jezebel. Remember that the prophet went up on a mountain. He said, okay, you get 500 of your priests over here, and we put this cow there, and you put all the water around it, And, Elijah was there, and he had a cow, and they could transport water all around and everything, and the other guys over there just had the cow, and they had all the fuel and everything. And he says, whoever sacrifice is accepted will be accepted as God. And so 500 prophets of Baal over there jumping and screaming, they're slashing themselves, and Elijah saying, maybe your God took a nap, or maybe he's at the bathroom or something like that, And he said, so finally he called down lightning and it sucked up the water and everything all around there. And he said, God is God, But the thing is, that was a tremendous victory for him. But even though he had a tremendous victory, he ran away because he heard that Jezebel was going to kill him. They just slew 500 priests. And he ran in the cave, and God had to tell him, he said, look, you're not the only one. Because he said, oh, I'm the only one left to serving you, God. He said, I've got several thousand people over here in the cave. I'm wondering, what are they doing in the cave? They're hiding from Jezebel. But anyway, what I want, and I'm going to have to stop here because my time is gone, and I'm going to have to finish this next week. But what I want you to know is here, when they said this in Deuteronomy, he says, to love God, obey his voice, cleave to him, for he is your life, and he is the length of your days. And that's in the Psalms, that even your days are numbered. Even the hairs on your head are numbered. And when Jesus said in the New Testament, he is God in the flesh, he said, I am the way, I am the truth, and I am the life. And no man comes to the Father but by me. So he was the perfect sacrifice. These other ones that they were sacrificing over here were only a substitute until the perfect sacrifice came. But all along the way, they were getting slack in the type of animals they would sacrifice. And they started as sick ones and lame ones, and even the priests sometimes would say, oh, that's okay, you know, you slip me a couple of bucks and you're okay. But the priests were even corrupt. And so God said he's going to wipe out the whole bit. And so they had to go into captivity. Let me see, I'll do one more verse. In verse 7 of chapter 8, he says, for they have sown the wind, and they shall reap the whirlwind. It hath no stalk, the bud shall not have no meal. If so be it yield, the strangers will swallow it up. Israel is swallowed up, now shall they be among the Gentiles as a vessel without pleasure. For they are gone to Assyria, a wild ass alone by himself. Ephraim hath hired lovers. And then in verse 13 of that chapter it says, they sacrifice flesh for the sacrifices of mine offering, and they eat it. But the Lord doesn't accept it. Now will he remember their iniquity and visit their sins. They shall return to Egypt. Now, Egypt is being used here as a metaphor because when you mention Egypt, they remember we were in bondage in Egypt. And that's what he's saying here. Now you're going to go back to bondage. You're going to go back to Egypt and you're going to be carried away by the Assyrians. And now on that map that I gave you, you see where Assyria is. Now, they were a wicked, wicked nation. But remember, they took the northern kingdom captive in 722. Then, later on, after, Isaiah's down here and Jeremiah's down here preaching to the southern kingdom, and Sennacherib from Assyria goes down to the southern kingdom, and they're going to destroy the southern kingdom, but they think we're just going to starve them out. And the prophet goes in Isaiah and says to the king Hezekiah, don't worry, they're not going to touch you. He says, and it's in here and I'll get that next week, they're not going to come near you. So they're out there, and the death angel comes through and kills 185,000 soldiers of the Assyrian army. So some of the leaders went back and without 185,000 of their troops. And that gave Babylon, which is next door to it, the power to go over and conquer Assyria and all of those people. And eventually Babylon went down and they captured southern kingdom. Then they went into captivity. And then you'll see over there the Medes and the Persians. Okay? Then Babylon was wicked, more wicked than God wanted them to be. And the Medes and the Persians eventually took over. And it was the Persian king Cyrus who prophesied in Isaiah that after 70 years of captivity, they could return to the land. And so that's when Daniel comes in and says he was reading the book of Jeremiah. And Jeremiah says, yeah, you're going to come back after 70 years. But that's it. But just remember, God is sovereign. He's holy. He's righteous. But he's full of grace and mercy and truth. And he is love. And that's what he's saying. Anybody who says they love God must love each other. And that's part of the fellowship. Make me love everybody. Make me love. Let's stand and we'll pray. And so,
I love y'all.
I love you.
You turn that off.
Hmm?